All right, let's look at some of these housing and household trends for a college town. So this video is for Michael. Michael, I meant to put this out yesterday. I, in fact, did a video on this yesterday, but I didn't like it. It was a little long-winded. So I decided to do it this morning, Monday, before work. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go over a lot of various metrics, population data really first, because that's going to flow through to everything, including the household data. Obviously, that information, along with things like active listings trends, things like the permitting data, DTIs, all sorts of stuff that's going to give you a clear indication as to who really lives in the area. And again, if there's any sort of validity to the idea that there's a structural shortage based on the fact that it's a college town, and the answer is right up front, there's just not. But I'm going to go over this, and we're going to get into stuff like group quarters because that's invariably what you hit on if you were talking about a college town. So we really just have to understand our definitions. And some of these visuals, like the one we're looking at here, are going to appear to be busy because there's multiple charts on the screen. But once I explain it to you, you're going to realize all I'm doing is presenting a lot of information in a way that I consider to be very concise, and it allows you to absorb uh, the most information as you possibly can in a very concise and efficient way. So, all I'm really doing here is showing the population data by age and by race. And maybe I'm showing it rather than a level as year over year or as a share chart. And that's pretty much it. So, up top, and I haven't really included the legend outside of maybe this one for the population by race. This is the population by age. It's for specifically Clarke County within the Athens Clarke County MSA. So there's like four counties that roll up into it, and it's basically telling me that population growth has slowed. In fact, it's actually negative year over year. But essentially, what's happening is you're seeing more of this gray creep in to the outright population, and that's the 55 plus group. So what I've done just quickly, and all these similarly colored charts down here, same color scheme, it's the same thing. It's population by age. So under 25 is in blue, 25 to 54 is in green, and 55 plus is in gray, indicating really that sort of silver tsunami. And essentially, yes, on the whole, this market is actually a little bit younger than the national figure, but on the whole, it is getting older. So if I kind of look at that, how it's changed year over year, again, all this information is as a stacked bar chart. You're starting to see more gray creep into the equation. Does that make sense? So if I zoom in on that, that's what I like about this software. Some of the stuff is hard to see because it's so outsized in some of these years, but gray is kind of creeping into the equation, very subtly getting older. But if I don't make really the distinction for age and I'm just looking at this thing by race, essentially what's happened here, this area has a pretty decent black population, black African American. But what's happened really, the growth is fairly concentrated among folks of Hispanic or Latino. Okay, so let me explain what these some of these acronyms mean. Alaska or American Indian, Alaskan Native is in blue. It's so small you can't even see it on the chart. Asian, yellow, black, African American, black, Hispanic or Latino, that's brown. Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, again, barely registers on here. And then white is that gray shading. So again, year over year, and remember, this is all like a stacked bar chart. So the interpretation is like there's just under 130,000 people in Clarke County alone within this MSA. As you can see, right, the main driver is folks of Hispanic or Latino, right, race. So now what I've done below is I'm just kind of looking at areas of interest. So what if I just looked at white by age, or Hispanic or Latino folks by age, black, same thing, Asian? That's what really the background color is supposed to convey. So this sort of pewter background is white, black, gray background. So these two charts, right, share year over year. Yellow, share year over year is Asian. And then Hispanic Latino, uh, share year over year again. So if I zoom in on this, essentially you're seeing broad-based participation across these main groups. So under 25, 25 to 54, and 55 plus. We've also seen a bit of an increase in the Asian population, but it is slowing as of late. And right, these are expressed as share charts, and that dotted yellow line is essentially how it stacks up against really a national benchmark. So if the gray shading came all the way down to that yellow dotted line, that would indicate to me that it's about in line with what it looks like nationally. So the white population is relatively younger. It's about in line for the black population. And it's actually younger too for both Asian and Hispanic or Latino folks. But it's all in all cases, it's getting older, but still younger on the whole. So I would say because Hispanic or Latino folks are the ones really driving the population growth here. This is pretty consistent with what you even see in my hometown of Nashville. And these are going to be folks who are really not making very good money. I just hate to say it, but it's also common to see when there's been a lot of construction and extraction occupations. It's very biased to Hispanic or Latino individuals. The same thing can be said for maybe folks who like clean hotel rooms. No different here. This is a lot of what I would just characterize as demand pull forward. When we pump the economy full of all the stimulus around COVID, people pull permits, especially in this market. We'll look at it in a second, where there's been a lot of multifamily development, 2+ unit sort of development. It's especially biased to, I would say, just like a lot of apartments and things of that nature, which is very common across the Southeast and Sun Belt. There's probably a component of, I would call, student housing sort of investing themes here. But as I said from the beginning, that's not enough to really argue mathematically that there is a structural housing shortage in this area, because there just isn't. So, but okay, let's look at the population now by what is really causing it to change. So this is we're not really talking about age here per se, or race. Directly. What we're just trying to figure out is demographically, okay, well, what is causing the population to change? So there are basically, we'll call it 3 buckets that would cause it to change. The 2 main ones are net migration. So that consists of both domestic and international migration, and then natural change, which is just the difference between births and deaths. If natural change is positive, that means births outpace deaths. As you can see here, they do, which is why it's positive. But again, net migration is made up of both domestic and international migration. These are identical, but the only difference between these two is that I've broken out net migration by domestic and international. So what I am saying is the driver, the main driver, is international migration. This is pretty much identical to what you see in Davidson County. So remember, everything here is nominal minus like the rate of change, right? The resident population, the outright level, it's slowing as of late. It's actually turned down. That's why the rate of change is actually negative. But let's say if I were to look at this as a rate, what you would see is that the birth rate is actually falling. Remember, this is nominal, so let's just keep that in mind. Now, if I look at the population by, say, group quarters, and I essentially say, okay, well, how many of these people are in households? Okay, households, and how many people are in group quarters? GQ, institutionalized, non-institutionalized. The bulk of folks are in households. So group quarters, that's going to, and I've actually isolated for it institutionalized and non-institutionalized, but the bulk of it is actually in these non-institutionalized buckets. It's primarily college and student housing. Okay, you see that's that pink area. It hasn't materially grown over time. And the other thing I would point out too, so yes, technically group quarter population relative to the resident population is actually a little higher here. You know, if I'm just looking at student housing, it's around, we'll call it 7% of the population. Nationally, it's like, we'll call it 1-ish%. But it's not material enough in the grand scheme of things to say, okay, well, that group is what's causing a housing shortage. Number one, because we have to understand our definition. A housing unit and group quarters are technically like distinct, and they're not like the group quarter population is not counted towards the housing unit uh, estimate, because again, those people are in group quarters. Okay, so you also have to factor in that student housing is not capturing all of enrollment. So let's say within Clarke County, which is what we're looking at, this is decades of data. Previous to this, we've been looking at annual data, but I want to give this thing as much context as possible, so we understand what's going on. So if I were to say for Clarke County, there's around, we'll call it triple the amount of folks enrolled in school, and I'm not making a distinction for those in student housing, and I were to just back out like the student housing portion of that and then recalculate something like housing units per capita, as I've done for the county all the way back to 1970 here, it's going to have the same shape of this trend. Okay. It's range bound for a reason. If you've ever heard me talk about this idea of whether or not there's a housing shortage, well, housing units per capita has been range bound in sort of really since the 90s, pretty much everywhere. It's because housing, the number of people per home can only get so small because that limits income growth. Okay. Because the fewer people per home means the fewer potential incomes per home, which is all the more reason that home prices can only diverge from incomes for so long. And the other people may, and I'll get into this in a minute, but people may assume, well, you know, if it's like somebody's rich daddy paying for the rent or whatever, maybe these things can go on unchecked in terms of home price appreciation in this market. Well, the answer is that on the whole, again, as I've alluded to, we're talking about a very small segment of Clarke County that is right. The households and the population is actually attributable to, say, the university. So again, I'm not equating enrollment for UGA as a whole, undergrad or grad. I'm just saying within Clarke County, we'll call it enrollment is around like 25-ish thousand people. It's just in Clarke County. I'm not looking at surrounding counties or, say, folks who are enrolled in some sort of internet-based course at UGA. Nothing like that. Just Clarke County. So the other reason incomes are not going to catch up to the cost of living here is, even when you look at these younger cohorts, they're already in the labor force. Okay. This is no different than the national trend. I calculated this for every single county in the country by age and sex. Same thing. This is literally the same trend that you see nationally. So, okay, let me go look at some annual data, housing units per capita. Notice this is a chart that a lot of people like to look at, and I decided to include Dave because I hate Dave so much because he's an idiot and he's trying to get you to buy his bags. He's a real low life. Anyway, what happens, and this is a starting point, remember, and we'll get into the household data later. But when this figure goes up, that's an indication that the market's very frothy. Well, what typically causes this to go up is people right? They go out and they say rent an apartment or they buy a home and they're forming families. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's just an individual going out. That would be a non-family getting a home. It drives this up. But when you have a contraction, as we did, right, in GFC, well, it causes this to move down. That's a sign of household consolidation. Now it's moved up again. So we're literally back to square one. And the only difference, I'm not necessarily concerned about the outright level when it comes to housing units per capita. And I just basically benchmark Clarke County against, we'll call it Auburn, Alabama, and obviously Tuscaloosa, because we're looking at college towns again. The only real difference here is the mix of things like occupancy or vacancy rates, the mix of renters versus homeowners, which oftentimes is associated with non-family households. And non-family households tend to be smaller in physical size, so that can mechanically drive this metric higher. I'm concerned about the shape, not necessarily the level. So down here, I just broke out these three counties, and now you can see really population and total housing units, what that looks like. And remember, when I say population, I'm not making a distinction for group quarters or anything. It's just the total resident population and then total housing units, so occupied and vacant. It's the broadest measure. It's going to capture everything. So let me look at rents from apartment list here real quickly. And what this is telling you, and now we're looking at it for the city of Athens, but the city, the county are fairly identical at this point because of redistricting. That now you're seeing year over year, it's falling. Now, around BTFP, this thing bounced, and all we did was kick the can. Basically, what, 3 years down the road at this point? This is really stupid. Now it's falling. These are effective rents. Okay, let's look at asking rents. This is from Zillow, and we are specifically looking at single family because everybody and their mother wants to say, oh, well, this is just a multi-family oversupply problem. Not true. Same thing is happening where you're starting to see rent growth really slow down. This is asking rents. It's not effective rent. It's not the greatest proxy because it doesn't translate into what somebody actually pays. But this is what it looks like. People just can't afford it. And look, we can actually examine DTIs. Remember, we're just thinking about this in terms of the home ownership side of the equation. Clarke County actually has a very low home ownership rate, and we'll look at that. That's why it's really important to look at rents here. But essentially, we have literally kicked the can all the way down the road, and this information is monthly. It's through October, where now we just created the biggest bubble of all time. And it's definitely worse on the renter side versus the homeowner's side. But that's why home sales are so low. It's because we priced out a very large chunk of the population. Now, you can actually observe home prices across markets well back in time, even to the 90s. And I basically just benchmarked Athens against some other college towns. So what you're basically seeing is it follows the economic cycle. Home prices actually went down around GFC. Now they've gone way up, especially in Austin. But the other thing too, and I would just point this out, and I guess I can look at FHFA for Athens in isolation here in one chart, and maybe that's a little easier to see the trend. But okay, if somebody is trying to say there's a housing shortage and in Athens as an example, and they're only say looking at an area that's so small that it only captures say the university itself, and they're claiming, well, there's a housing shortage there. Well, you're not really measuring anything. You have to capture the surrounding area to have a very holistic idea as to really what's happening. And I would just say in the fact that the proximity to, say, Atlanta has seen an enormous amount of investor activity, really post GFC. That trend that you really saw very heavy in places like Vegas and Phoenix, they basically took that same business model and they applied it over in a place like Atlanta, Charlotte is very heavy with those trends as well. It's always kind of been the case in many Florida markets like Tampa. I suspect that's what's been going on here. I don't have access to Athens MLS data, but by looking at this chart, I can already tell, and especially if I refer to Redfin's weekly data series, that this is for Clarke County, where this is all just a function of rates being too low for too long. We dropped rates to nothing around COVID, caused home sales to skyrocket, active listings went down. But now you priced everybody out of the market, right? So active listings are now moving higher. So if there was a true structural housing shortage, okay, structural, I don't care necessarily what's for sale or what's for rent, the entire bucket, what's not for sale, what's not for rent, what's vacant, all of that. If there were a true housing shortage and you're just kind of setting aside interest rates for a second, and we're saying that's irrelevant, this wouldn't be going higher. Okay. So prices skyrocketed and now price growth is starting to slow. Okay. And we're not making a distinction for property types here. Although when you look at the home ownership side of the equation, this is very biased to single family, common across the southeast and just the Sun Belt in general. This is eventually going to roll over because essentially you were already starting to see the beginning signs around BTFP that was going to happen. And then all they did was kick the can 2 years down the road, buy some time. And now we're kind of back to square one. The other thing I'll point out too is home sales are so low. We're talking about a very small area that it creates a lot of volatility in these numbers. So, I mean, you're talking about transactions around like what, 10, 15 for the week of February 15th. These are the most recent numbers. It's going to create a lot of volatility. A bit larger home prices, homes were selling. That's what this is indicating. And because the transaction volume was so low, it actually pushed the median sales price per square foot a little bit higher, and that's why it's bounced. But if you were to draw a line through this, you would see that it is gradually moving lower, and it'll eventually go lower because of what we just looked at in terms of DTIs. You can't price out everybody and expect that to go on just forever. I mean, that's like saying DTIs can go to 100%, and that creates a healthy market. No, it doesn't. So here's the permitting for basically like the city, okay, the county of Athens, Clarke County. They're basically the same at this point. So what I've done is I'm just showing this. This is monthly data. It's not seasonally adjusted. It's through October 2025. It goes all the way back to 1993. This is giving you adequate context. But okay, I just want to point out these are the units authorized, not the buildings. So a multifamily building is going to have multiple units per building. If I express this as buildings, this chart would render very differently. But you can express that as just single family, or you can say group everything 2+ together, which is what people typically think of as multifamily. So essentially, because demographics look very different back in the 90s and the pre-GFC period, you saw a lot of building, okay? And obviously dropped off, okay, around GFC. And really, this market, especially on the multifamily side, really, really picked up because we dropped rates to nothing and people pulled the fuck out of permits. No different here. But it's slowly tailing off. And look how quickly demand dropped off around BTFP. And then again, all we did was kick the can 2 years down the road. I can express 2+, broken out by 2 units, 3 or 4 or 5+. Essentially what this is telling you is there's been a lot of like big apartment complexes being built. Okay, in general, that's what's happened. Especially if you look at the stock of homes, owner occupied, renter occupied, by the actual structure itself. So I applied, okay, this is that same chart, but as a line graph rather than a stacked bar chart. And I applied a 12-month moving average so you could see that basic trend. It's very choppy when you look at it at a very granular level because some months there may not be any multifamily permits being pulled. But in general, what you see is that across, whether it's single family, multifamily, it tails off in a slowdown, and it's basically doing that same thing, but at a very much slower rate for both single and multifamily, because there's a lot of hand holding. There's a lot of we're there's this whole thing is stimulus driven, so it's really stupid. Okay, now I'm going to get into the labor data, which is sort of the thing that makes the most sense from here, because that's going to flow into my talking points around households and how all of those things are inherently related. But what I'm looking at here is this is monthly data uh, for Athens, Clarke County, Georgia. This is for the entire MSA. And this visual, it's the most recent data through December of 2025. It captures both surveys which measure local labor market health. So the survey that captures the unemployment rate locally, which is LAUS, that's this single chart down here. That's what that is. And then everything else where it says NFP, 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 that's comes from the local version of the establishment survey. And the establishment survey is the thing that gets quoted in terms of monthly job growth. And it's usually expressed month over month, seasonally adjusted, but I'm not a big fan of all these seasonal adjustments. Let's just look at it uh, NSA. So, again, I'm not a big fan of like just looking at a single line in isolation when it comes to NFP. Okay, I want to see the actual what rolls up into that number. So, this is telling me that okay, Athens, Clarke County has a lot of government employment. And that only makes sense because you have a public college in this area. Okay. But there's over 100,000 jobs in the area. The establishment survey, let me just point out real quick, it doesn't make a distinction for multiple job holders, part time, full time. It doesn't capture the unincorporated, self employed. It's measuring where the employer is located in terms of head count. Most people live in the vicinity of where they work. They may not live in the county in which they work, but in general, they live in the vicinity. And it also depends on the type of work that they're doing. Manufacturing type of work, you're probably, if you're like a laborer, you're going to have to go into work. Versus if there's like a lot of professional business services, those are the groups that tend to be remote workers. Remote work is elevated in this market, but it's not nearly uh, as high as you see in some of these markets where it's like we'll call it 25-30% plus of the population is actually remote workers. It's nowhere near that high. That's not what's happening here. So I can express this, right? We're just thinking about head count because this could in theory capture people with more than one job. Okay, this is the nice thing. The reason I like to look at this as a stacked bar chart as it is down here year over year is because I'm just thinking about bodies. I'm not really concerned about the rate of change. So the big driver, okay, because it's so hard to see what's going on here because of these COVID anomalies. You can't zoom this shit in when you try and put this information together in Fred. The big driver, just from a straight headcount standpoint, is government. And I would have to imagine when you look at government employment locally, a lot of it's education. I suspect that's what's going on here. But that's no longer really the driver. Okay. There's still a little bit of growth there, but the entire thing is literally just healthcare and government. This place is in a recession. You can't see it yet because there's so much emphasis on the unemployment rate being low as a sign of overall health in the local labor market. And that's just objectively false because people don't understand how that's defined. Okay, so let me just kind of explain that more in depth. So do you see how that's a problem? When you have just government and healthcare doing all of the job growth, you're in a recession. You just can't see it yet. Remember where it started down here? It went straight up. Okay, so This is, let me talk about the unemployment rate real quick. Everything that I mentioned, like in the establishment survey, when it comes to the household survey, it's household facing. It's going to capture where people are, surveying where people are actually living. Right, we're not making a distinction by even like the type of industry and the associated unemployment rate. It's a consolidated figure. The way in which the unemployment rate is defined is very narrow. Okay, so have you been actively looking for a job in the past 4 weeks? Kind of a small window. The other thing too is like we're not even really accounting at a local level like why somebody's unemployed. Are they unemployed because they're a new entrant to the labor force? Maybe they re-entered the labor force. Maybe they are on layoff. Maybe they're a job leaver. And what about like the associated labor force flows and how that could mechanically be suppressing the unemployment rate? What about the fact that immigration, as we know, even in this market, you see it nationally too, where now that international migration is unwinding, that is mechanically sort of suppressing the unemployment rate. So, in other words, that sort of component on the fact that we're seeing this ongoing trend of folks from 1 month to the next going from being employed to not in the labor force. If that flow was to basically reverse and go from being employed to unemployed, okay, and you consider all the other labor force flows, that could mechanically cause this thing to move much higher. But it doesn't really matter because right, these labor markets are already weak, and we already know that the population is younger, which means this is even more relevant to something like rents to incomes and DTIs. By the time this goes higher, and it will, it's just a matter of time, you're going to start to see whether it's these landlords or these homeowners have to lower their price. We already saw that DTIs were through the roof. So if I just look at total non-farm, okay, total non-farm is this. It's the whole thing. Private and government. So private is everything less government here. This is the whole thing. If I zoom in on it, basically what you see is when it goes negative, the unemployment rate goes up. And if it goes really negative, the unemployment rate goes way up. Well, we're negative again. It's the lowest it's been literally in this post-COVID period. So you should expect that rents and asking rents, effectively, it's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse from here. The other thing, too, is if your population is younger, I guess I can get over to some of this household data, talk about it for Clarke County. Those individuals, we know they're already in the labor force. Everybody's already in, men, women, doesn't really matter. They are going to draw more of their income from, if you're looking at household incomes, they're going to draw more of it from wages and salaries. That's true here. That's why that information we just looked at is more pertinent than people really give credit to. So you can look at household incomes by the source. So is it wages and salaries? Is it Social Security? Is it some form of public assistance? All of those things. Well, for this particular group in Clarke County, wages, it's going to be wages and salaries. But if you were to look at that information trended over time, what you would basically see is that wages and salaries is no longer driving household income growth, which is why median household income on an inflation adjusted basis is no longer increasing. And it's very low on a relative basis compared to the national figure in this market. Or, nationally, that figure is closer to 80,000. It's very, 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 very low here. This is also why the average household size, especially amongst renters, is moving higher. They are under distress. But let me just kind of explain what we're looking at here, because all of these things are inherently connected. I'll start up here. So the housing stock in Clarke County, there's just over total housing units. Okay, there's over 50,000. We'll call it 55-ish, 60,000, give or take. Now, if I just look at owner-occupied versus renter-occupied, this is telling me that this area has a very low home ownership rate. I mentioned that at the beginning. It's around we'll call it 40%. Nationally, that figure is closer to 65-ish%, give or take. So everything else on here, all I am doing is basically looking at segments, like so owner occupied, renter occupied, but like based on physical household characteristics, which would be something like this down here and these similarly colored charts down here. Now, the background is just telling you which one it relates to. So anything in blue is owner occupied. Okay? And it's just literally it's the same kind of data just rendered for a different tenure. Renter occupied is in red. Okay. That's renter occupied year over year by the size of households. That's renter occupied by households experiencing shelter costs, rents to incomes. This is renter occupied by the type of family or non-family household it is and by their age. So, okay, let me just kind of explain what the problem is when it comes to renters. Essentially, what we're looking at is the distribution of households and how they're experiencing shelter costs. That dotted line represents the national figure of cost burdened households. Nationally, around 30% of renters are cost burdened, meaning they pay 30% plus of their monthly income towards rent. If I capture that for this market, it's above the national figure, and they continue to build, and it hasn't actually improved affordability. So it's essentially kind of a, it hasn't really improved. So there's a growing share of renter households that are cost burdened. Okay. And they're severely cost burdened too. So this 50% plus monthly income, that figure is closer to 25%. And we know that it's not just all these people paying, their parents are paying their rent, even if they're not on the college campus. So people just need to not talk about those things, especially if they don't understand that. But if you were to say, look at homeowners with and without mortgages, with would be blue, without is gray, gray indicating the fact that you're much less likely to have a mortgage and you're much less likely to be cost burdened. If you were older, that now shows that over 42% of owner-occupied households do not have a mortgage. So my point is, I would prefer to just look at homeowners with mortgages, because if you do have one, you're much more likely to be cost burden, especially if you bought recently. So let's do that same exercise. Nationally, around 30% of homeowners with mortgages are cost burden, meaning they pay 30% plus of their monthly income towards shelter costs. Basically, what you're seeing here is, since we'll call it, 2013, 2014, affordability has not meaningfully improved. But because not everybody buys a home at the same time, at the same price, with the same financing terms, it's not going to flow through the stock of homeowners evenly. The folks who are under pressure is anybody who basically bought and financed their purchase 2022 and on. And I'm not showing it here, but in general, let's say if you were to look at the origination data, HMDA, whether it's that or even something like Fannie Mae, essentially what you see across markets, and it's definitely true here, is that you're basically seeing somebody finance their home. It's going to be a lot of high DTI stuff and high LTV purchasing. So on the whole, across renters, there's a clear problem in the fact that because they are subject to market rates, many are drowning right now. But if you go look at it from the standpoint of homeowners, even though this is a low homeownership rate environment, it's really stress on the margin. It's those people who bought 2022 and on and financed their purchase. That's the issue here. Now, the other thing too I would point out when it comes to especially renters, especially when you look at the average household size and the fact that it's moving higher, The one thing that I would point out is that, okay, let's look at it just by size, age, and type. And essentially, let me just explain this real quick because this is the legend that applies to this. Green, pink, and blue, those are family households. Across renters, family households are around 50% of the whole pie, meaning it's much more concentrated in non-family households. That's part of why the median family household income is, or median family income across all households is lower because it's a renter market, really heavy with renters. And across renters, it's a lot of non-family. So it's like, we'll call it 75% is non-family. And a lot of them are living alone. But you've also had some renters come in here and double up. So non-family is yellow and gray. And the darker respective shading is just indicating older age. So there's a lot of non-family doubled up renters that are under the age of 35 here. And if you were to actually look at renters by tenure, you've actually seen a good bit of Asian individuals come into this market. But on the whole, as we saw here, affordability has not meaningfully improved. If you actually look at not just the rate, like the going in rate, the effective rate of rents to incomes, but how many are experiencing right shelter costs a certain way. This is much more material to the whole pie because it's a low home ownership rate environment. Remember, when the average household size increases, that is a sign of financial distress because right, it's not improving materially here. It's not improving. In fact, it's deteriorating. See? It's not improved. So this is really dumb. So if I were to look at, let's say, these non-family household trends, okay, it's about in line with these national figures. What's happened here in this market is you've actually had older families come in. Okay, that's the green. They account for a growing share of these households. As of late, you've actually seen, we'll call it divorcees. Okay, so they even if the spouse is not present, that's what no SP means. There's actually been older, like divorced people, but they still have kids. Female would be that pink shading, and males would be that blue shading. Come into this market in from 2023 to 2024. You saw earlier on uh, older and we'll call it middle-aged non-family households driving household growth here, but on the whole, it's slowing. So, said another way, and let me just kind of express these two charts where I'm cutting right the data by the household type, uh, age, and size. Right, this is, remember, this is owner occupied. We're talking about the blue bucket. This is renter occupied, red. Now I'm not looking at it in terms of a share, just the outright level. The population has been increasing in this market, but it's fallen off as of late from 23 to 24. Okay, well, household income or household growth across both renters and homeowners is no longer increasing. Look, that is consistent with household consolidation. It's moving higher. It's kind of flat for owner occupied, but renter occupied, okay, it's not growing anymore. That is a sign of a slowdown. So when household growth slows, you have an affordability problem. People pull their resources to pay for things like housing. That causes the average household size to move meaningfully higher, as it is across renters, less obvious across homeowners. Part of that is due to falling birth rates, things like that. All of which culminates in the fact that now we're starting to see household incomes slow. So this market will eventually correct. It's not going to correct overnight. It's frothy as hell. But it is what it is. So hopefully that was helpful. I will quit rambling. And if you have any questions, let me know. But that was a much more robust take on how all of these things apply: population, households, all of it. This is no different than really any other market that I see, even if you were to examine other college markets. It is what it is. It's just the biggest bubble of all time.